Hi, and welcome to episode 211 of Page One, the Writers Podcast. I'm Marco, and regular listeners and viewers will be expecting to see Tarek as well, but unfortunately he couldn't be here to record this intro and outro bit of the podcast, but he is in the main interview. If this is your first time on the podcast at Page One, we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, find out how they got into the industry, and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. And we've got a whole back catalogue of great guests from authors, screenwriters, comic writers, video game writers, so please do check that out if you haven't already. We've also got lots of episodes with industry experts like agents and editors as well, giving some really great advice. But we're kicking off this new batch of episodes with an absolutely brilliant guest. We are speaking with Jay Kristoff, author of the Nevernight Chronicle series of books, the Illumini series of books, and most recently the Empire of the Vampire series of books. And I've just read both the Empire of the Vampire and the Empire of the Damned, which is the first two books in his latest trilogy, and it is fantastic. I really love it. So it was a great opportunity to speak to Jay about that, about hearing about how he got into writing from a career initially in sort of marketing and advertising, and how he's brought sort of that creative side of things into his writing. We talk about, writing fighting scenes, which he is brilliant at, really visceral fighting scenes in his books, if you haven't read those before, and also about dark characters, the sort of grim dark fantasy, but flawed characters, I guess is what I mean more, and how they're more interesting than your sort of black and white type characters. So without further ado, I'll get straight into the podcast, and then I'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest. But as Tarek would say, on with the podcast. So I always kick off the podcast with the same question, which is, did you always want to be a writer?
No. I wanted to be, many things. For a long time, I wanted to be a rock star. I think I wanted to be a musician. But having learned about the realities of being a touring musician, I'm glad that I didn't actually get there in the end. It sounds like a pretty horrendous way to live. Like, I go on tours for book launches and I'm on the road for maybe a month. And that's about the extent of, like, by then I'm completely peopled out. So I don't know what it would be like to be touring for a year or 2 years on end. So no, the plan was to be a rock star, but that didn't work out so great. I was always kind of interested in art. And so I studied design at college and eventually became an art director. So I worked for kind of big multinational advertising corporations, and I wrote television commercials for a living. I did that for kind of 13 years, which was, at least it was a creative job. I wanted to do something that was creative, that I could.
Yep.
I always kind of had an artistic temperament, but the reality of that job is you're using your creative ability, to sell people shit they don't need, with, to buy it with money they don't have. And also you're not really captain of your own ship. You don't have a lot of control over the end product, and being a creative in that environment, it's pretty frustrating experience. You have a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And the bigger the job, the more cooks are present. So the odds of getting an actual good idea all the way through to the finish line, very, very slim. It's like, it's like World War I at the Somme. You're just sending your ideas up over the top and watching them just get gunned down over and over again. It's a good way to build resiliency and
I guess
thick skin in regards to criticism, but it's not exactly creatively rewarding. So but that's,
having said that,
that's kind of where I thought.
What was the advert you were most proud of then? What's your favorite advert that you made over that 13 years?
I don't actually know. We did a lot of charity work, which was cool. I'm probably proud of that because you're actually trying to do something positive.
Yeah.
You're trying to change the world for the better.
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
opposed to, selling toilet papers or a new car.
Yeah.
So yeah, we did some charity work that was cool, and that was kind of worthy, and it felt like we were using our powers for good. Um, but a lot of the time, like I say, you're convincing people to buy things they don't need with money they don't have. So,
Yeah.
and I don't want to diss it. Like, it was a lot of fun for a lot of years. It was a really creative environment, and it was a lot of fun. Working with really cool people, and I've still got some mates who are still in the industry today, kind of running their own shops and trying to do things a little bit differently. So I don't want to knock it. It was a good job for a lot of years, but I'm glad I don't have to do it anymore.
And so when did you start? Were you writing at that time? When did you start writing seriously, I guess?
I started writing with a view to get published in 2008,
Right.
and I was still working in ads then. I remember I have no idea what possessed me. I just had an idea in my head one day, and I was bored, and I wrote down this idea, and over the course of a few days, it became a scene, a chapter. Uh, I had no real aspirations to write a book. I just had an idea, and
Yeah.
I enjoyed writing, and I enjoyed working on something that was wholly and solely mine. And I liked, using that creative impulse for something other than ads, because I hadn't
Mhm.
done that in a really long time. Like, I used to draw, I used to write music, I used to do all kinds of things, but over the course of working, it's a pretty high impact job. It takes up a lot of time and a lot of energy. Um, you don't, it kind of leaves you drained at the end of the day. You don't have a lot of energy for anything creative when you get home. You just want to sort of lay out in front of the TV or a video game. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, over the course of a few days, it became a chapter, and I just kept working on it. It was a really half-assed, busy kind of way of getting into writing, but I enjoyed doing something every day that was mine. And
Yeah.
over the course of 18 months, that chapter just fleshed itself out into a book. And for the longest time, I didn't tell anyone that I was doing it. I didn't even tell my wife I was doing it until it was kind of 3/4 finished, because A, I didn't know if I ever would finish it,
Yeah.
and B, I didn't know if it would be any good when I did. Uh,
Yeah.
so it was just something that I kind of kept to myself, weirdly, until it was almost done, because I was afraid that I would never actually finish it. And eventually I did. It's a terrible book, because most books that you just fall into with no plan whatsoever,
Yeah.
and no structure in place, it's a mess. But it got me into the ritual of kind of writing every day, and it got me, it gave me an appreciation of going somewhere and working on something that was mine. And
Mm.
like I said before, when you're in a communal creative experience, you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and when things go badly, you can often blame it on the other guy. Like, you can blame it on the
Yeah.
client, or you can blame it on
Yeah.
the sound guy or the director, or the internal agency politics or whatever. Like, this was just mine, and so if it was good, it was because I was good, and if it was shit, I must be shit. But even though that book turned out badly, it made me kind of fall in love with the ritual of writing every day. And so after I finished it, I shopped it around for a little bit, and I was really lucky. A couple of agents that I sent that manuscript to, it was a bad book, but they liked my style, and
Mhm.
they kind of told me as much. Usually well, I don't know if it's the case now. I haven't been looking for an agent, you know, this 14 years ago is
Yeah.
2010 probably. So the procedure might be totally different, but I was lucky enough back then, I didn't get form letters from a couple of agents that I respected. And they said, "Hey, we can't, we can't take this on, but we like your style, and send us your next thing." And that, you know, if you've ever been in the query trenches, you're just getting smashed in the face with boilerplate rejection
Yes.
over and over and over again. So
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
those couple of little crumbs of encouragement were enough to fire me up, and to go back for another shot. So when I went back and wrote again, I was a little more methodical and a little more disciplined in the planning stages earlier on. And that ended up being the book that got me my first publishing deal. So yeah, shout out to those agents who kind of took the time to give me just that little bit of encouragement, because that was all I needed.
Yeah, you do need that sometimes, definitely, when you're any sort of encouragement is what you're looking for, because as you say,
It's
it's a lot
gold.
of you
Yeah.
get slapped in the face by rejections, or you just get ghosted by people and you never hear back.
Just get nothing.
Yeah.
I remember I had signed the deal on the Lotus Wars, my first book, my first trilogy, and I was still getting rejection letters from the first book that I was shopping around, but I had sent 18 months or 24 months prior. It's like these agents were finally getting back to me almost 2 years after I'd queried them with just these boilerplate rejections. So that was pretty funny. But yeah, it's amazing how, that tiny bit of encouragement gave me all the drive that I needed. So yeah, it's really important.
Yeah.
And when you compare those two books, that first one that you did that went nowhere, and the second one that got you your agent, what do you think is the difference between those two books, and why did your second one succeed but the first one didn't?
Well, the first book that I wrote, I mean, this is 2010, like I say. It was a vampire book, weirdly enough.
Okay.
And I don't know if you may remember, there was
another
another
little book out there
vampire
at the
book
same
that was doing quite well at the same time. And yeah, the vampires were kind of played out. So there was
Okay.
that. I was starting kind of behind the eight ball, writing a vampire book. And it was like an adult horror vampire book in the middle of, well, probably at the peak of Twilight hysteria. It was probably not the best use of my time. You know, it was a good use of the time in that it got me into the process of writing. But it probably wasn't the most strategic move that I could have made. In terms of what was the thing that pushed me over the line, I guess it was a slightly more commercial concept, and I had gotten better. I'd gotten better structurally. I'd gotten better trying to craft a sellable hook. The reality is, again, this is 14 years ago, and I don't know if things have changed, but back then, you're sending off full manuscripts, but you're sending off full manuscripts to an agent. Realistically speaking, the agent doesn't even see the manuscript. Your manuscript is being read by his assistant, who is an extremely overworked, extremely underpaid, and she's probably reading those scripts on her computer on the subway ride to and from work, because when she gets to work, she's actually working for paying clients. And it's usually a she, and these agent assistants tend to be gals back in the day anyway. And they're looking for an excuse to stop reading.
Yeah.
The one typo, one weird structured sentence that just bounced because they got 500 others to read this week, and they just keep coming in. And so I got a little bit better at, crafting a hookier premise, writing a good query letter. That was an art form in itself. And that was just a matter of practice and kind of studying and keeping my eye on the ball on what other people were doing. But like I say, it was so long ago now, I don't know if any of that knowledge even applies these days. I don't know.
I mean, I think the basics of that still definitely apply.
Yeah, I guess crafting a good elevator pitch was something. And weirdly enough, that was a skill that I had almost learned in advertising, because a good ad has like a 7-8 sentence slogan that kind of summarizes everything you need to do. Ideally, it's 2 or 3 words. Just Do It by Nike probably being the most famous and successful. So being able to distill a 90 or 120,000 word fantasy novel down into an arresting sentence that kind of catches someone's attention. Weirdly enough, I had been doing that for 13 years in a slightly different form. So I think that was probably helpful as well. In a weird way, advertising was a really good boot camp to becoming a writer for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, I can see that.
But it was just a more commercial premise, and I just got better at it. Like, it's like anything, you do something every day for a year, you're okay. You do something every day for 3 years, you're probably better. So stick-withedness was a real big factor.
And obviously Storm Dancer, actually, not only did it get published, but you became a finalist for various awards as well, which must have been we were just talking earlier about, any sort of positive news
Yeah.
spurs you on. But for
Yeah,
your first
sure.
book to get nominated for awards and stuff must have been an incredible feeling and sort of validation for all your hard
Yeah,
work.
it was really cool. Yeah. You know, it's a long time ago now, and it's hard to remember some of those feelings. But yeah, putting your work out into the world for the first time it's terrifying.
Yeah.
Like you feel this tremendous sense of accomplishment, but also, there's that fear. What if people don't like it? So yeah, the award noms and stuff like that, it was cool validation. But at the end of the day, if you base your sense of self-worth and the validity of your work on the opinions of other people, you're inevitably going to be disappointed. So I kind of quickly stopped learning to do that. I write books for me. If I'm proud of the book, then that's what matters most. If other people like it
Yeah.
and buy it, obviously that's awesome. But yeah, I very quickly learned to stop basing my uh, sense of accomplishment on the opinions of other people. One,
Yeah.
one visit to a Goodreads page on
Oh,
any one
God. Yeah, no.
of your books will disavow yourself of any illusions that you have any kind of talent whatsoever. And weirdly enough, our brains are wired to prioritize negative information over positive information. So
Yeah.
you can read
Stuff
100
in your head.
reviews and get nominated for a dozen awards, and you read one blistering 1-star review, and that's the thing that stays
Yeah.
with you for days and days on end. So yeah, better off writing for yourself.
Yeah, definitely.
I wanted to ask you about the Illuminae files. The series of books you wrote with Arne Kaufman, which you kind of wrote after you're still doing the Lotus War series, obviously. But these Illuminae file series, you classed them or you called them as young adult books. And I wondered what, in your mind, like how do you differentiate between a title that is an adult novel and a young adult novel, and how do you know what it's going to be before you start writing?
I mean, YA is a really different beast now to what it was back when we were writing. Like we were writing Illuminae, I think in 2013. I don't know. It's one of those weird things. It's like that Judge Potter's definition of pornography. It's like I can't define it, but I know it when I see
Yeah.
it.
Uh-huh.
YA is was kind of the same. There's no reason why you can't deal with some pretty heavy themes in young adult. I guess principally your protagonist is going to be a teenager, but I mean the protagonist in the Nevernight books is also a teenager, and I've never considered those YA books,
Yeah.
and they weren't published as YA books, even though
Mhm.
my readers troll me because I've spoken about this till I'm blue in the face, saying Nevernight isn't YA, but it inevitably gets put on the shelves in Barnes and Noble in the YA section. So I have readers who kind of take photos of it on the shelf and just ping them to me on Twitter or Instagram. Yeah, in terms of what actually defines a YA novel as opposed to an adult novel, I guess you probably have to have a teenage protagonist. But mostly YA is a marketing term.
Yeah.
It's a demographic.
Mhm.
Depending what you read, upwards of 60% of the people who actually read YA aren't teenagers. They're,
Yeah.
women that are 20 to 30 years old. So it's not even about the target demographic. It's more, Jesus, it's more a vibe in a weird way.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's become a weird term and a weird place. I'm kind of glad I don't hang out there anymore. It was fun for a lot of years, but I'd rather just I write adult epic fantasy. The rules for writing adult epic fantasy and what you can and can't do are pretty clear. So it's a lot simpler in that respect. Um, but yeah, in terms of why we wrote that as a YA novel, I don't know. If Amy was principally a YA author, and the Lotus War books were kind of a crossover. I guess
Yeah.
they were pitched as a crossover book anyway. It kind of danced the line between adult and YA, but it was published by an adult imprint over at Macmillan. So I guess technically it's still adult, but yeah, the idea that we had when we started kicking it around, it just kind of lent itself to a YA novel. It just felt right from the outset.
Yep.
Some projects just have a feel to them from the get-go. I knew when I started writing the Ammonite books that they were going to be adult novels almost from the first page. So yeah, sometimes a project just feels right. And what we're intending to do with the Illuminate books, yeah, just kind of lent itself to what YA was at the time anyway. It's a little bit different nowadays, but yeah, it
And
just
how
felt
did
right.
you find writing with someone else as well? Because obviously the Illuminate files as well, the structure of them is really interesting because it's
Yeah.
it's sort of epistolary, emails and all sorts of things like that tell the story as you go through it. Did that, I wondered if the actual form of the book helped when writing with someone else, as opposed to writing a sort of straight prose book between two authors.
Yeah, I think it did. In a weird way, like I said before, working in advertising was a weird kind of boot camp for being a co-author as well. When you're a creative in an advertising agency, you work in a partnership situation. So you have an art director and a copywriter. It's just two people in an office and your partners, and you think of ideas together. So in a functional creative team, you're kind of kicking ideas back and forth across the desk all day. And you learn to work collaboratively. You learn not to be precious about your own work. You learn to get a thick skin and then take criticism and, learn to keep top of mind that the goal here is to come up with the best story or ad that you can come up with. So in a weird way, that was a really good place to learn how to be a co-author.
Yeah.
In terms of us, the structure lending itself to us working more together, I think that's probably true because I hadn't done it before. Amy had co-authored books before, so she was a bit more of an old hand at it than I was. And yeah, I think jumping into long form prose from the get-go would have been strange. Whereas, yeah, initially we were just, when we were getting a feel for those characters, initially we were literally just kind of role-playing IM conversations with each other, just texting each other, kind of stepping into the role of these characters to get a feel for who they were and how they talked.
Yeah.
It's kind of a free-form role-playing experience, I guess. And yeah, it was quick. You're only writing 2 or 3 sentences and you're getting kind of feedback immediately. So yeah, I think for me it was really helpful. But like I say, Amy was an old hand, so she kind of held my hand, I guess, for the first few weeks, just while we were getting a feel for whether we could work together and what shape the project was kind of going to take.
Yep.
And initially, yeah, we had. I mean, Amy, the whole thing started as a dream. Amy and I were kind of buddies before we started writing together. We're both baby authors. We both lived in Melbourne. We both had debuts coming out within 6 or 7 months of each other. So we just used to get together and have brunch every month or so and just shoot the breeze and talk about what our experiences were. And,
Yeah.
My editor said this word and I was too embarrassed to ask what the word means when she first said it. And now the conversation's gone too long and I look like an idiot. What she's talking about, that kind of stuff. And one day she walked in and said, "I had a dream that we wrote a book together last night." And she couldn't remember what the book was about, but she knew that it was an email book. It was two people emailing back and forth with each other. That's kind of how the whole thing started. And
Nice.
so, we sat down and said, okay, well, why are two people emailing each other? Well, they're separated physically. They're not in the same place. Where are they? Okay, they're on 2 different spaceships. And it kind of all went from there because we're both kind of sci-fi nerds.
Mhm.
So we came up with this idea that a boy and a girl were emailing each other back and forth on these spaceships. And why would that happen? What had led to them being on 2 different ships? Okay, their planet was attacked. And it all just kind of flowed out organically. So we didn't go into it with any kind of plan. It just kind of built upon itself as we were kicking around the idea initially. Because we were both working on other projects at the time. I was working on Lotus Wars and Amy was working with her other co-author, Megan Spooner, on their trilogy together. So we didn't even know if this thing was going to get off the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we came up with the idea of Aiden being like this God's eye. It would be the God POV narrator, came up with the idea of it being damaged because I came from a kind of arts and design background. I like the idea of doing weird things with typography and design in the book to try and break the idea of what a book could do. And so Aidan was kind of the excuse, like, okay, it's damaged, and the way it perceives the events on the page dictate the way the typography is laid out on the page. Maybe we could try weird stuff like that. So I just started doing weird typography experiments and sending them to Amy at like 3:00 in the morning. And it all just kind of fell together in a weird way. So it kind of came about really organically. But yeah, it started with just us pinging IMs back and forth to each other. So it's weird how something so big can kind of fall out of something initially so small. But it was really cool, really creatively rewarding.
Was it a difficult, because I love books like that do take, formatting risks and change things and all of that sort of stuff. But we often hear that things like that are a very, very hard sell to publishers who are obviously very risk averse and things like that. So was it a hard sell to find someone to publish it?
No, I mean, we thought it would go one of two ways. Either it would just be too crazy and stupid for anyone to go near it, or it would be just crazy and stupid enough for everyone to mistake it for geniuses. And fortunately, it fell into the latter. So yeah, it was like what we ended up doing, because we knew it was so weird. I kind of fell back on my design background again, and I think we wrote a 120-page sample. We didn't write the entire book because we thought it was so weird that no one would buy it. We didn't want to write the whole goddamn thing. So we wrote a 120-page sample, and I sat down on Photoshop and InDesign and kind of mocked it up. So a publisher who was looking at it, didn't have to read a big description of this page is laid out like an email and blah, blah, blah. I just did it. So the publisher could kind of flick through those 120 pages and get an idea, okay, this is going to be a visual experience as well as a reading one. And yeah, we sent that off to our agents, and they got super excited about it. And very quickly, I think we had 5 or 6 publishers bidding on it. It kind of skirted that line. I guess we landed on the right side of, this is so crazy it might work, as opposed to this is too crazy for us to even try. So we were fortunate in that. But I think the fact that we laid it out and showed them what we meant rather than tried to explain what we meant helped us a lot. I think we would have been pushing shit uphill with a pointy stick, like trying to explain it. It was easier to show. But it got a lot bigger than we actually expected it would, which was cool. It was that was the book that let us quit our day jobs, which was great.
Okay.
Had to change our lives. So,
and then after that, looking at obviously you wrote a whole bunch of those books. You wrote Lotus War books, and then you had your Nevernight Chronicles and Empire of the Damned series, and they, I think, a lot darker in tone and a lot of modern fantasy. To be mildly perhaps, and a lot of modern fantasy, I think at the moment anyway, does feel quite grim and dark and grounded. We've chatted before in the podcast about how that kind of classic, I guess, Tolkien type, elves and dwarves, and it seems to have slid out the way a little bit, and for the kind of stories that are being told now. And I wonder what your thought is, and why are we moving towards this kind of House of the Dragon type, these kind of dark, grim, realistic fantasy stories?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Game of Thrones changed everything. Like it was changing before then, but Thrones, I think it's difficult to overstate the impact that Thrones had on the way regular audience members see fantasy.
Do you mean the TV show or the book series?
Well, both. I mean, the TV show when did the TV show first air? It's like 2011 or something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
Like the books were already blowing up pretty big at that point. Like I was I was a Thrones tragic back in the day, man. I used to play the collectible card game of Game of Thrones. Like, I was big time into it. I had this hilarious experience once. I went to a con with George R.R. Martin here in Australia. And this is when I think the Red Wedding had just aired. And so
Right,
Game of Thrones is like bigger than Jesus. There's like
Yeah.
12-year-old girls walking around cosplaying as Arya. It's like, are you old enough to be watching that TV show? But anyway, a whole bunch of the cast members of Thrones came down for this con. And so I'm this Game of Thrones tragic, and I have my, like, Mark Addy, the guy who played Robert Baratheon, he was there. And so I bought in my copy of Robert Baratheon, and I got him to sign the card and stuff. And the actors were all loving it. It's like, oh, that's really cool. They didn't quite realize the impact that it had on geekdom before the show, because they had come to it with the show.
Yeah.
And I went up to George and kind of mustered up the courage, and there was a card called Valar Morghulis. It's like a board clear. It just killed everything on the board. And I walked up to him and said, "Hey, George, I'm a big fan." Just shooting the shit. And then I said, "So listen, this is a weird request, but I play the Game of Thrones card game." And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, God help you." So, man, that's not quite what I wanted to hear. But yeah, so even by then, the books was starting to shift the landscape, at least in fantasy. But when it became kind of a pop culture phenomenon, it kind of broke the borders of what fantasy was, and kind of people were talking about their water cooler conversations on Monday mornings.
Yeah.
It's like, it's the first time you see an R-rated movie. PG-13 movies don't have the juice anymore. It's the first time you drink bourbon as opposed to sipping one of your dad's light beers. Like, once you find the thing, you can't go back. You can't go back to preschool once you've been to college. You know what I mean? And I'm not dissing heroic fantasy as preschool. It's not simplistic, but once you've had your eyes open to the concept of darker stories, more realistic, dare I say, and grounded stories, even though you're telling stories about dragons and whatnot, it's difficult to go back to that, I guess, more heroic fantasy, more optimistic. And you probably can say simplistic. I love Tolkien, don't get me wrong, but the morality of Tolkien is pretty simple. It is good and evil, dark and light. There's not a lot of gray. There's not a lot of moral ambiguity in Lord of the Rings. For everything that Lord of the Rings has done for us, none of us would be here if not for rings. So, you won't find a bigger Tolkien fan than I, but they were simpler stories, from, I guess, maybe a more innocent time. And I like I say, I think it's difficult to overstate the impact that Thrones had on both writers and what audiences expect from a fantasy series nowadays. Like I say, once you've been to university, it seems strange going back to high school. So in terms of, these things also move in cycles as well. Eventually, everyone will get sick of gritty, dark realism and harken back to those, more heroic kind of styles. And there are still writers that do it. I would say Brandon is probably still at the forefront of kind of more traditional heroic fantasy, and he's bigger than Jesus out of hell. So there's obviously still an appetite for it. But there is an expectation among some readers now, I think, that they want something a little more gritty and a little more grounded. And those are the stories that I've always liked to read, and that the stories that I like to tell. So I'm lucky in that respect. I started writing at the right time.
There's also like the fantasy, almost there is a slight pushback against the sort of grim dark, because there's things like legends and lattes and sort of cozy fantasy.
Oh, sure.
I guess you would call it
cozy
well.
fantasy.
So I mean, there's definitely different categories of fantasy now. Maybe in a way where there wasn't before. It seemed all more, as you say, the sort of heroic perhaps more simplistic. But I was going to say your protagonist. I've just finished Empire of the Damned. I absolutely love the Empire books, and
Oh, thanks, man.
the protagonists in those books, none of them are your classic heroes. They all have
Yeah.
fairly large flaws. Gabe, Selene, even Dior as well. They're all flawed characters, and that brings that sense of realism as well. I mean, do you just find it more interesting to write these sort of fully rounded, I guess, characters that have flaws, even if they try and do good things sometimes?
Yeah. I think that's just the nature of the beast when you're writing. I hesitate to use the word grimdark. We haven't come up with a better descriptor for it, sadly. But yeah, I think that is part and parcel of the package. The shape of those narratives kind of demands morally flawed individuals. Stories of reluctant heroes, people who are doing bad things for the right reasons. And sometimes doing good things for the wrong ones. As long as they're doing the right thing at the end of the day, they're still heroic, despite what their motivations might be. I think that is part and parcel of the experience. But yeah, in terms of writing, I've always kind of been drawn to more morally ambiguous, grayer characters. I mean, that's the way people are in real life. I recognize the need for archetypes, and paragon figures. I actually really like a good paragon in some of my fantasy stories, but I find they're more effective when they're juxtaposed against people who are a little more broken, a little more flawed. But also those characters are just a little more interesting to me to explore. It's just the kind of story that I've always gravitated towards, even before I was writing. They were, the characters who were flawed, the characters that I could maybe see parts of myself or people that I knew. And, I am as flawed as the next man. That element of realism, I don't know, it makes the story more believable, but it also makes me fonder of the characters. I don't know anyone who's perfect in real life. I'm certainly not. And so, yeah, I feel more of a kinship with people who feel like people,
Yeah.
someone, not to hack on Tolkien, someone like Aragorn, his only struggle is with accepting the fact that he has to be king one day. That's his character arc. He has to step into the greatness that was bestowed upon him at birth. He isn't forced to do terrible things for the greater good. So, those heroic figures, they were necessary in laying down the foundations of fantasy that we're all kind of building upon. And like I say, we wouldn't be here if not for those kind of more paragon, heroic, mythological type figures and stories that were the foundation of fantasy. But yeah, the more morally flawed, broken, questionable characters have always been more interesting to me, both as a reader and a creator.
Yeah,
there's more
And-
fun.
I'm not as far as Marco is. I'm halfway through the first Emperor of Vampire book, and it's excellent. I'm really, really enjoying it. And I think
I apologize for the incoming trauma. All the terrible things you're about to experience.
Honestly, during Empire of the Damned, a book is good when I wanted to read it, but I also wanted to stop because I could just see the horrible things that were going to happen, and I didn't want them to happen.
You can see the car crash happening in slow motion.
Exactly.
Brilliant. I look forward to that.
When I ended in Vampire, I remember I got a text from my editor. It was like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning or something. It was just one word: "Is busted." Texted back, "Did I make you cry?" And she said no comment. So that was as the highest compliment. It's pretty hard to make Tash Barden cry. So yeah, I knew I was on a winner.
Good.
Well, I mean, I think what I'm enjoying about it so much is that it feels like a really cool fusion of like a fantasy kind of story in a world, but with vampires, and that's something I definitely have not seen that kind of those two kind of horror-y and fantasy worlds meshed like that. For me, was a kind of new thing, and I really like that. And I wondered, why did you pick vampires? And was it a kind of conscious choice to say, I want to write a really dark kind of, make vampires horror again, make them less Twilighty and more kind of, we've got this like Nosferatu movie coming out soon and stuff. It feels like vampires are coming back to that kind of dark horror area again, which is the way vampires I always really liked.
Yeah, I mean, they were definitely the vampires that I grew up with when I was a kid.
Mhm.
When I was a kid, vampires were monsters. They were the monsters inside ourselves and the monster under the bed.
Yeah.
They were enemies to be defeated. But I mean, I've loved them ever since I was a kid. It was all over for me when I saw The Lost Boys when I was like 12 years old or something. I was way too young to probably watch that movie. But
Yeah.
I knew I was immediately in trouble. The Lost Boys, the protagonist, he was a young teenage boy like me. But I immediately went into the bad guys. Like, the vampires were so much cooler than the heroes
Yeah.
in that story. I've loved them ever since. I read Salem's Lot when I was 10, I think, or 11. Like, way too young again to be reading that book. It turned out okay. Yeah, so I had always wanted to write a vampire novel. Like I said, the first book that I
First
ever
one you did.
wrote was a
Yeah.
vampire story. It was just wrong, It was wrong for a few reasons. One, because I hadn't learned how to write yet, but also wrong in terms of timing. But one of the world building ideas I had in that original vampire novel, it was like it was reborn in the Empire series. The idea that vampires can't choose who they turn. It's
Mhm.
just kind of, it's a product of chance. You get bitten, you die. Sometimes you wake up straight away and you're young and beautiful forever. Sometimes you just stay dead. Too bad, so sad. And sometimes 4 days go by and you decompose and then you turn into a vampire and you're stuck in this half-rotten body with your brain decomposed and most of your higher function intellect gone with it as well. That was an idea that I had like way back in 2008,
Okay.
and it got reborn in the Empire novels. So it had always kind of been bubbling away in the back of my head that I would revisit vampires in some way, shape, or form. I kind of had to wait until the time was right and a long enough period of time had passed between the Twilight phenomenon and um, also my skill set just uh, needed I needed to up my game.
Yeah.
When I started writing Empire, the biggest book I had written at that point was about 180,000 words. I think was the third Nevernight book, and Empire ended up being like 250 or something. It
Yeah.
was the hardest book that I had ever written. And I didn't have the chops to write it even 5 years previous. I couldn't have written it. I didn't have the skill set. So I kind of had to wait until I was good enough to tell the story that I wanted to tell. So it was a factor of all those, waiting until the time was right in a lot of different aspects.
Were you told that it was too long? And that's a massive word count, and they're massive books. Then you often hear people saying like that's, chop it into half or something. But were you told to cut things out?
No, I had a lot of trust of my editors by that point. I think I kind of earned my stripes with the Nevernight books. Um, Yeah, like the Nevernight books were a weird one. No one expected those books to do what they did. The advance that I got on Nevernight is the smallest advance I've ever been paid.
Okay.
No one thought those books were going to do anything. I remember we were on tour for Gemina, the second Illuminae book, because Illuminae kind of got on the New York Times bestseller list straight away. It kind of blew up immediately. And I had just been quietly working on Nevernight on my own in the background, and I had sold that through to the same publishers who had published the Lotus Wars, but I got paid less money. And I remember telling my publishers, this is no diss to my publisher. I love Rick Millen, by the way. I love Pete, my editor. But this gives you an idea of the expectations of sales for Nevernight. Like, I was on tour for Gemini. I was at Book Expo America on Random House's dime. So another publisher flew me over there. And I wrote to Macmillan and said, hey, we've got this new series, Nevernight dropping in like 6 months. Should we maybe do something while I'm at BEA? And they said, yeah, no. I was
We're
there. I
good.
had a
We're
box of
good.
10. I had a box of 10 arcs, 10 advanced reader copies. That was my whole marketing budget.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, and it kind of just took off thanks to reader word of mouth. And because of the success of that largely kind of fell out of my own marketing efforts and yeah, that kind of groundswell of reader enthusiasm. I think I earned a lot of points with my publishers, that they gave me a lot of trust by the end of the Nevernight Chronicle. They kind of figured I knew what I was doing, and they knew what my readers expected, what they were looking for in the next thing. So yeah, the edit letter on Vampire was pretty light. Yeah, but both of my editors in the UK and the US just kind of loved it on site. So yeah, I think, yeah, the heavy lifting I did on Nevernight kind of paid dividends on Vampire.
And in the Empire books, one of the things that strikes me is, there's epic fight scenes, and I know some authors kind of shy away from fight scenes, or just sort of want to get them over with, because sometimes they can be quite sort of rote, not that interesting to read and stuff like that. But you really feel every landing of a vampire on the ground, and all that sort of stuff, and every hit is very visceral. Do you enjoy writing those fight scenes? They reminded me a lot of the sort of From Software games like Elden Ring, Bloodborne, and that sort of thing.
Oh sure, yeah, I'm a massive Bloodborne fan.
Yeah.
Bloodborne was one of when I was briefing my illustrator. I was kind of sending her mood boards just to put her in the headspace of the aesthetic that I kind of had in mind, and I sent her a lot of Bloodborne art. Yeah, in terms of writing, I love writing action scenes. I find them the easiest. I have a kind of visual mind. Like, I come from a visual arts background, and so when I'm writing, it's difficult to articulate. It's like I see the film in my head. I can see the movie playing on the backs of my eyes. And when I'm having to craft dialogue or create exposition or show politics or complex systems, I can see it, but it's not as easy to translate those visuals into words. Whereas if I'm just watching an action scene, I get pretty close to flow state. Like, thought and word and keystroke are almost simultaneous. It's just the way my brain works. I have friends who are similar like that when they're writing dialogue. Like, I find dialogue is a lot more difficult for me. And yeah, it's just the way my brain is wired. I see with a lot of clarity. And so when you're talking about pure physicality and pure visual, it's pretty easy to translate that into words. And I like I say, I kind of lose myself in the flow of that. And I think that's why those action scenes kind of, I've had people say they feel almost cinematic. They have a flow to them.
Very much.
I think that's just a function of the way my brain is wired. Like, I remember I had a weird experience on Twitter a few years ago. I saw a poll, and it said, like, close your eyes and picture an apple. Which apple do you see? And there was kind of 4 illustrations of apples, and the one on the far left was a high resolution photograph of a green apple, and the one on the far right was just a green blob, and the 2 in between were variations of that fidelity. And I thought everyone saw the one on the left. I thought everyone saw photorealistically. I didn't realize until I was 45 years old that not everyone's brain works visually the way mine does. So yeah, that was a really eye-opening part of the pun experience for me. But yeah, I think because my brain works that way, it kind of lends itself to writing action. And I know, I try, and my daily word count target is about 2,000 words a day. That's kind of what I'm comfortable in when I'm drafting. I know if I'm writing an action scene that I'll be done in like an hour, 2 hours, and I get the rest of the day off. So I look forward to writing action scenes because I know I'm going to be done by like midday, and then I can just fuck around the rest of the day playing video games or whatever.
I mean, I wanted to ask about the process, because I'm imagining for a book the size of like the Empire books, you do a fair bit of planning before you sit down. And do you know what you're going to be writing, or is it a case of sitting down and just seeing what happens?
It's really interesting. Up until Empire, well, I think it's interesting. I don't know if anyone else will, but up until Empire, I was a total pantser when I was doing my solo stuff.
Okay.
I just made it up as I went along. I had no idea what I was doing. Like in terms of the day to day, I would sit down at the keyboard. I would maybe think about what was going to happen in the shower, and then I would sit down at the keyboard, and things would just happen. And I have no idea how I constructed a trilogy that's coherent, like the way Nevernight is writing that way, just flying by the seat of my pants. Like I would have a rough idea of where the novel was going to end, and I had a rough idea of how the meta plot was going to play out. But I had no idea what was going to happen from chapter to chapter, or even from beat to beat. I might have a couple of set pieces that I knew were coming up, and I would kind of drive the car towards those. But by and large, I was just making it up day to day. But when I got to Vampire, I was trying to do the same thing. I had a rough picture of it in my head, but it was so big. And, there's 3 different timelines. There's young Gabe, there's old Gabe, and there's framing device Gabe. The young Gabe storyline is basically a hero's journey, and the old Gabe storyline is basically a road movie. Trying to figure out how they were going to cut and interplay, and how revelation in one, or how seeding a plot in one was going to result in revelation in the second one. It was just too big and too complicated, and the book was spiraling out of control. I remember, this is like 2019 at the end of the Dark Dawn tour. I had an appearance at a festival in Prague, and my wife flew home and I stayed on in Prague, and the plan was at the end of the month, I was going to stay there, live there for a month. Cause if you're going to write a vampire book, Prague is a pretty gothy city. So in terms of soaking the ambiance, it was a pretty good place to write. I was going to lock myself in a flat, smash the rest of the book, and hand it in at the end of November. And about halfway through that stay in Prague, I realized the book was just completely broken. It just wasn't working. I wasn't doing what I needed it to do. And so I had to put in this terrible call to my agent and say, listen, man, the book's going to be 6 months late. I got to fix it. It's not working. And for the rest of that trip, I forced myself for the first time to sit down and actually plot the book, because I had done that with my co-authored projects. Because when you're writing with someone else, you have to have a plan, because, if you just kill off this B character that they were planning this major scene with, 3 chapters from now, you've ruined the plan. So Amy and I would sit down and plot about 100 pages in advance. So at least we knew what the other was doing, and then we would go away and write our respective pieces. So I knew how to plot, but I just hadn't applied that discipline to my solo work. And that Prague trip in 2019 was, I basically looked myself in the mirror and said, okay, you got to put on your big boy pants and sit your ass down and realize you blew this deadline, but you need to actually get a plan for this novel. Because I think at that stage, I think the book was like 300,000 words long, and I hadn't even really started the older Gabe plotline. I was still in the weeds on young Gabe.
Right.
It was going to be huge. It would have been oh, God knows how long it would have been. It would have made Brandon Sanderson look like a toddler, and it would have never got published. So I had to actually sit down and plot. Okay, act 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are the major beats. This is what the breakdown of that part is going to be. Here is a point of revelation. Here is a point of action. Here is a big set piece. Go. It was the first time I'd actually done that. But once I did that, the whole thing just kind of fell into place. And since then, I've done it religiously. I became a born-again plotter. I never applied that discipline to my solo stuff, but now it's kind of essential. And I'm very grateful for it, because I was finding when I was working on Vampire, I was just wasting a lot of time and a lot of words. I would wander off down a cul-de-sac and I'd be 80,000 words into it, and then realize I took a wrong turn like 6 chapters back. I've got to back the truck up and throw all those words in the bin. So I was just wasting tremendous amounts of time. And when you've got publishers and deadlines and readers, you don't want people to have to wait, 8 years for the next book. I had to actually sit down and be a little more methodical about it. But, it's great feeling now when I sit down. I've handed in the third book of Empire. It's kind of off with my editors, but, sitting down every day now, instead of twiddling my thumbs for an hour and wondering what happens next, I just consult the plan and say, okay, this happens next, and then I can get my words down. So I'm glad I took the time to kind of apply that discipline to my solo stuff. It's a lot easier.
So you just said there the third Empire is with your editors and stuff. So when is there a date yet for when that's going to get published?
There is. We're announcing it tonight, I think, or tomorrow. It's November 2025.
Cool.
November. I think November the 4th in the US, and it'll be around about the same date in the US. The UK and Australia. So yeah, November. All barring acts of God, I could get notes back from my editor and say this is absolute trash. You got to rewrite the whole thing. It feels really good. It feels, as far as the trilogy go, I think it's the strongest of the 3 books.
Wow.
Yeah, it was. I think it was in April. We did the tour for Damned, and I did the UK and Australia and the US and France. And then my wife came home and I met up with a buddy in Spain. We went to a city called Toledo, which is this old kind of walled medieval fortress city that the Crusaders built. And we just lived there for a month, and I just kind of worked on book 3. And at the end of that trip, I'd kind of broken the back of the book. I had this idea about 2 weeks into the trip that was like, you twist a jigsaw puzzle piece and it just slots into place. And then the whole puzzle just fell into place all around me. So when I got back home, the book just felt like riding downhill. Like I'd kind of, I had discovered the key to the whole novel. It kind of flipped it on its head and really energized me. So the last half of writing that book was probably the most fun I had on the entire project. So yeah, it feels like the strongest of the 3. Nice. I'm really happy with it. Endings are hard. Sticking the landing can be the toughest part of the whole process. But this one just felt right, man. I can't wait for people to read it. I think it's a great one.
I can't wait to read it. I'm annoyed it has to be November, but
I'm being November now, so building up everyone's expectations. I should tell them it's shit, so that it's pleasantly surprised. It's fucking garbage to buy it. No, please buy it.
And and you've had obviously stuff optioned for the screen. Is that something you would be interested in trying your hand at, like writing a screenplay, something a little bit different? I know you've done comics obviously before as well.
Yeah, it's a different discipline to be sure, and I think it's a little bit arrogant to think just because you can play the guitar, you can play the violin, like similar principles, but very different. Like I learned that writing comics. Writing the series that I did for DC was a real eye opener. You know the fundamentals of story, but there's a whole aspect of comics where the physicality of the object kind of plays a role in the narrative, like the turning of the page serves as a beat. So if you're going to reveal something, you wait until the page turn. Like I didn't even know that. I've read comics all my life and I didn't realize the function that the physicality was serving. So I'm sure there are similar things in writing television as well. But yeah, if the opportunity presented itself, I would love to. Fingers crossed that there's things happening in the background on Empire that hopefully we get to reveal. I've been sitting on it for like almost 2 years now for one reason or another, but hopefully we get to talk about it really soon. So that would be cool.
That would be very exciting.
Nice.
So I mean, you've handed the Empire book in. What are you currently working on? If you're able to tell us, rough, even in a vague way, what are you working on?
I've sold in a new trilogy. I actually sold it in, when would it have been? Start of 2022. I sold it in ages ago. Jesus, what is that? That's almost 3 years. Is that correct? Am I doing the math on that right? Yeah, it's almost 3 years ago. It's like the theory is you sell in I've always kind of stuck to this adage, you sell in your new thing right after the first book of the current thing goes out, because theoretically speaking, you're never as popular. You're never
Yeah.
moving as many
Yeah, yeah.
copies as you are when that first book drops.
Yeah, it
unless
was.
something
Everyone says
weird
like it's like
happens.
half. Each one sells half one before or something.
Pretty
so the
much.
third,
Yeah, that's pretty much the math of it. So you never look as quite as shiny in your publisher's eyes as right after that
That's
first
the
book
moment, yeah.
comes out. So I had my pitch kind of lined up and I sent it off, I think in January or February, and Vampire came out in, I think, September. So yeah, we sold it in ages ago. And it's just kind of been sitting, bubbling away in the back of my head ever since. So I'm doing pre-prod work on that new trilogy at the moment. And we announced that, I think we're announcing it next year at the London Book Fair, which I believe is in
Oh, nice.
March or May.
Yeah, Mark.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's been in the can since January or February 2022. So I sold in a new trilogy, and I also sold a standalone, which is another fantasy book that I was kind of writing in my free time back when I had free time a few years ago. So that's almost 3/4 written, but tonally it's a little bit different. It's a little bit lighter, I guess. Whimsical, I guess, if you want to apply that term to it. So I'm going to wait until the first book of the new trilogy is out before we release that standalone, just so people don't think I've completely shifted gears and turned into a different kind of author. Like the darker, gritty fantasy is kind of what I love. Those are the stories that I like to tell. But this standalone is something a little bit different. So yeah, we'll wait until book one of the new thing is out before that drops. So yeah, we'll announce the new thing, London Book Fair, next year. But it's already sold in, I don't know, 20 countries or something. So everyone in publishing knows about it already. It's just you guys don't yet. But yeah, it'll be a lot of fun. It's similar in tone to kind of the Empire and Nevernight books. It probably won't be as huge as the Empire books. It'll probably be more like Nevernight in size, I think.
Yeah.
I say that now. It could get bigger as I write it. It's kind of multicast, multi-POV. So that'll be interesting. But yeah, really looking forward to it. I'm kind of in characters design, world building stage of pre-production at the moment, and that's a lot of fun. I kind of, I've been living in, I love Empire, as a series. It really changed my life, but I've been living in it for 6-7 years at this point. So it's good to kind of be working on something different for a while, at least until my edit notes come back. Then I'm right back into the shit with Gabe.
Yeah, exactly. So those were the main questions that we had for you, but we like to end every podcast by asking our guests the same questions. The first of which is, what was the last book that you read?
The last book I read was a crit read for a friend, so I can't actually talk about it. The last book I read, I think it's called Just Beyond the Light. Yeah, I got it right. There you go. It's called Just Beyond the Light. It's a book by a guy named Randy Blythe, who's the lead singer of a band called Lamb of God. I used a Lamb of God quote in the epigraph of Empire the Vampire. And a reader of mine was a fan of the band, and he shot Randy a message, and Randy and I just started talking, which is really weird. It's the guy whose music I've been listening to for like 10 years. He just DMs me on Instagram one day out of the blue with a picture of him and Empire the Vampire in his hands. So yeah, we just kind of became buddies. And he wrote an autobiography called Dark Days. I don't know if you know anything about him, but he got charged with manslaughter in the Czech Republic. A young guy came off the stage at a gig they did there back in, I think, 2012, and he hit his head and he died, unbeknownst to the band. And when they rolled up back in the Czech Republic 2 years later on a new album or a new tour, Randy just got arrested at the airport and charged with this kid's murder because it was alleged he pushed him off the stage.
Oh shit!
And so he spent time in a Czech Republic prison, and he was fully exonerated. There was no foundation of fact to any of it, but he wrote an autobiography about his time in jail. And his subsequent book, it's kind of, I don't know, it's part memoir and part philosophy, I guess. life lessons that he's learned. He's lived a pretty interesting life, as you can imagine, being a touring musician for 20 years and frontman of this massive metal band. Struggled with a lot of his personal demons, and he's kind of come out at the end a lot healthier and a lot more positive. So it's a really, really cool book. And I think it's out
Interesting.
real soon. I think it's out, like he's on a speaking tour for, oh no, it's not out till next year. It's out 18th of Feb.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So it's kind of part autobiography, part philosophy treatise, I guess this is the best way to describe it. But yeah, he's a really interesting, sharp dude. So if you're into that kind of thing, yeah, it's a really cool read.
Cool.
Nice. What about the last film that you saw?
I saw Craven the Hunter last night.
Oh, is it any
wow.
good? I mean, it looks awful, and Sony's Spider-Web movie things are dreadful, apart from the animated stuff. But is it as bad as it looks?
My mum taught me if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all.
Is it better than Madam Web?
I didn't see Madam Web, so I don't know. I thought Aaron Taylor Johnson, I think, is the actor's name.
Yeah.
He's good. I actually really like him. I think he's a cool actor, and
I like
he
him a lot,
does
yeah.
what he does what he can with what he's got. They didn't give him a lot. Some of the special effects looked cool.
Okay.
I'm
wasn't
getting the
tour de
vibe
force,
of what
let's
this
put it
film
that
was.
way.
Strong recommend then, and that's what I'm getting
Yeah.
from this.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't pay. I got free tickets to the premiere, so the price was right.
Well,
Yeah.
You got to try. You got to try.
Exactly.
At least they had a shot.
What about TV? What TV have you been watching recently?
What TV? I'm watching The Old Man at the moment, which is the new Jeff Bridges thing.
I love the first season. I've not seen the second one yet.
Oh yeah, so we're watching the first season at the moment, which is really cool.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah.
Yeah, we're about halfway through. What else? I just finished Blue Eye Samurai, which is the animated series on Netflix.
That. Yeah.
Man, it's killer. It's so
amazing.
goddamn good.
That's brilliant.
I think episode 6, where the protagonist, I won't give anything away, where the protagonist assaults the castle. It's kind of a dark moment before the dawn.
The layers, the floors.
Yeah. I think that is, well, I don't think, I know, that is the best animated action sequence I've ever seen in my life. And it puts most film action sequences to shame. It's absolutely extraordinary what they did. Cannot sing its praises highly enough. That was an incredible show. One of the best television shows I've ever seen, let alone animated series. So everyone involved in that has just done an incredible job. And I'm also watching a biography series called WWF Legends, which is really weird because I was never into wrestling as a kid. But I've kind of fallen down. I watched a documentary about Vince McMahon, the guy who used to own WWF. It's on Netflix called Mr. McMahon.
It's good. Yeah.
And I also watched a series called Dark Side of the Ring, which is kind of about, the shadier side of wrestling.
Yeah.
And weirdly enough, I've just fallen into this wrestling hole. So even though I didn't watch it when I was a kid, I'm now an expert about the WWF and WWE.
It is a fascinating world, though.
It's extraordinary. Yeah. I mean, they were storytellers as well. They are storytellers. They're just telling a different kind of story. But watching the way it kind of metamorphosed. Like I had buddies who were into it in the 90s and 2000s, so I was always familiar with the concepts. I just never watched it myself. So it's kind of like I've been on the outside looking in, and now I've kind of fallen into it. It's fascinating, also really tragic. Like a lot of these guys end up either really, really hurt or dead. As far as a sport, it's hard to imagine one that takes a bigger toll on the athletes involved than that. Like, I just watched an episode with The Undertaker, who had like a 30-year career, and he's a legend. He's probably the biggest wrestler in the history of the sport. Like 3 decades in it, but he can barely move. Like he moves like he's 100 years old. He's a big guy.
Yeah.
Like I think he's 6'8" or something. Like he's massive, but yeah, he moves like he's 100 years old. It's obviously something that he loved, but like anything, you love it too much, it destroys you. And yeah, it's a really unforgiving sport. But yeah, really interesting documentary series. I think it's
Nice.
WWF Legends or something it's called. So yeah, I'm watching a bit of a bizarre mix lately. But yeah, great TV.
On the
There's a lot
animated
more
thing,
interesting things happening.
I just wanted to ask: have you seen Arcane? That was another brilliant animated
Oh,
series.
that's
that I
great.
loved.
Yeah.
I've seen the first season and it was absolutely brilliant. I have heard not great things about season 2, but I'll watch it eventually. I haven't seen season 2 myself. But the first season was absolutely amazing. Amazing storytelling as well as amazing animation. Like
Yeah.
they did stuff on Spire with, Beyond the Spider-Verse, which is a major feature film with $100 million budget.
Yeah.
Like,
100%.
those 3 projects, Spider-Verse, Arcane, and Blue Eye Samurai have, they are to animation what Game of Thrones was to fantasy. They've just completely changed the game. Like you can't look at just regular cell animation anymore without comparing it to one of those 3 projects.
100%,
Just groundbreaking, game-changing stuff. Yeah, the people involved in it should be so proud of themselves. Like,
the Spider-Verse stuff, I feel you can pause it almost pretty much any frame, and it's like a really incredible
it's like a
image,
painting.
like a poster. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And the way, man, I could gush about Spider-Verse for hours. The way they slightly tweak the animation based on what is happening on the screen. Like the style, if you watch carefully, the style like subtly shifts back and forth depending on whether they're doing action or dialogue, quiet or loud. Yeah, just genius level animation. Everybody involved in that project is an artist of the highest caliber. Like, it's both in terms of the story that they're telling. Like, they're just great stories that are not themselves, but to do that with, quote unquote, a cartoon, it's mind blowing to think that animation and animated storytelling has come so far. Everyone involved in that should be super proud of themselves. Absolute artists.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, the very last thing we always do is a super quick fire either or, and there's no right answer to most of these apart from perhaps one at the end. But we'll start off with let's go for sci-fi or fantasy.
Probably fantasy. It's a line ball, but fantasy was my first love, so we'll go with that.
Nice.
DC or Marvel? And if people are listening, Jay is wearing a Superman t-shirt here.
I am wearing a Superman t-shirt, and I've written for DC, but I have to say Marvel. I started reading Marvel, so you kind of never forget your first love.
Nice.
So yeah, Marvel. I like the both.
TV or cinema?
At the moment, TV, head and shoulders. Yeah, TV is a new frontier. It feels like they're doing things there that have never really been done. And in terms of storytelling, you just had more time in a 8-episode, 52-minute per episode story than you do in 2 hours in a feature film. So the stories they're telling just tend to be more complex by their very nature and better as a result. So TV.
Nice.
Night owl or early bird?
Night owl. Yeah. I try not to be. I'm trying to be more disciplined about it, but left to my own devices, I stay up late and get up late. But my wife and I go to the gym together in the morning now, so it's kind of getting me back on a more adult time scale. But yeah, left to my own devices, I stay up till about 2 a.m.
And the last one, real book or ebook?
Real book. Yeah. I totally get ebooks. They're great for taking a holiday. You can pack 20 books in your Kindle and it's only the weight of a Kindle. But I love the object of a book. It's why I try and do something a little different with every release that I do. With the Empire series, we put in the illustrations. With the Illuminae series, we did the weird typography and graphic design. With Nemonite, we did the footnotes and some strange type.
Yeah.
I like the idea of making reading a book an experience, and part of the experience. The conceit in Vampire is that the historian who's recording Gabe's story is also an artist, and he's sketching elements of the story as he writes it. So when you're reading that book and you see one of those illustrations, it feels like you're reading the book that Jean-Francois is writing. That's the thought. I had this amazing experience once. I was on a tram, and the gal across the aisle from me was reading Illuminae. And I was kind of watching her reading it. I didn't want to look like a creeper or anything, but there's the sequence in Illuminae where one of the protagonists, he's a fighter pilot, and he's involved in this dogfight in space, and he's kind of zooming in on the critical point in the structure that he needs to shoot in order to blow it up. And we tried to visualize his attack run by having the typography running in a tightening spiral as he's kind of closing in on the target. The type is kind of twisting around the page, getting tighter and tighter.
Rotating this book.
Yeah, and I saw this girl reach that page. She kind of turned the page and frowned at it, and then I saw her doing this with the book.
Brilliant.
And it was just the coolest experience, seeing someone interact with a book.
Yeah.
In a way that you normally don't. That kind of enhances the experience of reading. That was one of the coolest moments of my life. So yeah, I try and do that with every book that I write, and the physicality of the object is kind of essential for that. So I totally see the use and need for ebooks, and I am a big audiobook fan. I listen a lot now. I don't read a lot because I'm kind of reading all day. It's my job. I'm looking at a computer screen all day, so I listen to a lot of the books that I read. But the actual physical object of the book, there's something magical and beautiful about it that I don't think I'll ever fully do away with. So yeah, it's physical for sure.
Excellent.
Nice.
Well, thanks very much to Jay for coming on there. I really, really enjoyed speaking with him. As I say, I've loved his latest books, and I can't wait for book 3 in November this year. So it seems very far away right now, but it maybe gives me time to catch up with some of his other books as well. I thought it was really interesting what he was saying about how the Nevernight Chronicles didn't get much of a marketing push. This is something we've spoken about with other authors, and also in our sort of sister podcast, Drafting Notes, about the sort of help that publishers can give to books. If a book has a lot of push behind it, then you'll get in, the front windows of bookstores, you'll get in the magazines, you'll get in the big announcements in the bookseller and all that sort of stuff. But without that, it can be very difficult even for the best books to make a mark. So it's encouraging to hear when someone hasn't had that push behind them and has still made a huge success of it. And I think in Jay's case, it's just because, his writing is brilliant. He writes really compelling and exciting stories. And also, I think, fantasy is having a bit of a moment. It seems to be growing and growing as a genre, in part thanks to things like Book Talk and things like that, even if what Jay writes is maybe not your sort of standard Book Talk fantasy fare of romantasy and stuff, which Book Talk really seems to push harder than anything else. But yeah, we'll put links to Jay's books in the podcast bio if you want to get those. And thanks again to Jay for coming on to the podcast. Next week, we have another great guest in the form of Delilah Dawson, who has written a whole range of books, from sort of tie-in franchise books of Star Wars. She wrote a book about Phasma, the character Phasma from the latest trilogy of Star Wars films. But she's also written lots of comics. She's also written adult fiction. She's written young adult fiction. She's got a whole range of experience across a whole range of different types of books. And she talks to us all about, the sort of hustle that is needed, I guess, to make a success of it in that across those different genres, and talk in detail about her writing process. And it's a really great chat, so please do join us for that one. If you enjoyed today's episode, please do take time to rate and review us on your favorite podcast app, as that helps us to continue to get great guests on the podcast. If you're watching this episode on YouTube or Spotify, you can leave a comment down below. If you want to get in touch with us, you can drop us an email at podcast@rightgear.co.uk, or you can find us on most social media at UK Page One is our handle. We are no longer on X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it, but we are still on most other places, so you can find us there. And it's always great to hear from you with suggestions for guests and things like that. If you didn't know, we also have a Patreon, which gets you perks like early access to the episodes, video of the episodes if the episode isn't a video episode, timed exclusive access to our drafting notes series of podcasts, which is all about me and Tarek having discussions about the writing craft. At the top tier, you also get Page One notebooks. You get books from our past guests and things like that. So please do check that out. I'll put a link in the podcast description. But otherwise, we hope you have a great week, and we'll be back next episode with another great guest. Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, be sure to hit that thumbs up button and hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode like these ones down here.
And if you want to get in touch, you can do so by finding us on our social media platforms up here, or drop us a comment way down below there.
But otherwise, thanks for listening, and join us for the next episode.
See you later.